So, welcome back to the SQL Server series. In our last video, we learned how to write subqueries using the where clause. Now, we didn't cover the having clause, and this is because it is used in a similar way to the where clause. The only difference would be, you would be using the group by clause that we covered in an earlier video, and your search condition would most likely include an aggregate function. So in this video, we're going to cover some examples on how to write subqueries using the from clause as a table specification and the select clause as a column specification. Subqueries are typically used in the from clause to create derived tables that provide summarized data to a summary query. Now, for some of you that are familiar with other programming languages, you'll know that a derived class is created through the process of inheritance, which is known as the base class or superclass. And so derived classes are used for argumenting the functionality of base classes by adding or modifying properties in it. This is going to work pretty similar but a little different. Basically, our derived table will be a table that is derived from the base table, which is going to be the table in our from clause, and then the subquery is going to be the derived table. So I'm going to select all from invoices. And as a matter of fact, let's just go to our AP database because I don't want to have to specify my database. I'm going to select all from invoices, and from this table, what I want is my invoices.vendor ID, and then I want to get the max invoice date. I want to name that my latest invoice. And then I'm going to get the average of my invoice total from here. I'm going to name that my average invoice. Then here in our from clause, now we're going to derive a table by using a subquery in a from clause. So I'm going to say join, and then I'm going to get my top 5 vendor ID, and then here I want to get the average invoice total as my average invoice, and then that's going to come from the invoices table. This is deriving it, and then I'm going to group by vendor ID. I'm going to order by average invoice in the descending order, and then this subquery is going to be named top vendor. So I'm going to say this is going to be as top vendor, and then the join is going to be on invoices.vendor ID. It's going to be equal to top vendor, which is the subqueries table that we just named it, dot vendor ID, and then we're going to group by invoices.vendor ID. And then I'm going to order by the latest invoice in the descending order. So here we are using a derived table to retrieve the top 5 vendors by average invoice total. Our derived table is another join into the invoices table, but we named it as top vendor, so that way when we close our subquery here, we're doing a join from invoices to top vendor on the vendor ID. And then we're doing our group by, and we're going to run this query. And you see here, now we have our top 5 vendors by the average invoice. Now, I may not have gone over the top clause with you guys yet. And so the top clause, if you specify the top clause in a select statement, space the number, you will only get the first 5 rows back in your result set. If I were to change this to 25 and then run this query, then you see now I have the top 25 rows here in my table. So that's how the top clause works here. So a subquery that's coded in the from clause returns a result set called a derived table. And when you create a derived table, you must assign an alias to it, like we did here when we assigned top vendor alias to our derived table here called invoices. So derived tables are most useful when you need to, further summarize the result sets of a summary query. And that's pretty much what we did here. And this is how you use the from clause as a table specification. And next we are going to look at how to use the select clause as a column specification. In most cases, the subqueries you use in the select clause will be correlated subqueries. And when you code a subquery for a column specification in the select clause, the subquery must return a single value. However, a query that includes a subquery in its select clause can typically be restated using a join instead of a subquery. Because a join is usually faster and more readable, subqueries are seldom coded in the select clause. So keep this in mind when you think about using subqueries in the select clause. So we're going to take a look at a subquery using the select clause. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to select all from vendors. And then in here, I'm going to select, I want my vendor name, so I'm going to get the distinct vendor name, because I don't want any duplicate vendor names. And then I'm going to use my comma separator, and then I'm going to open up parentheses here. This is where my subquery is going to be in my select clause. And I'm going to select the maximum invoice date. And then that is going to come from the invoices table. And then I'm going to say where invoices.vendor_id is equal to vendors.vendor_id. Remember, this could be restated using a join, and that's the way it is performing. And I'm going to name that as my latest invoice. And then at the end of this, I'm going to order by the latest invoice in the descending order. I'm going to run my query. And you see we have the distinct vendor name and the latest invoices, which is the maximum invoice date from our invoices table, and that is joined on the primary key from the vendors table to the foreign key of the invoices table on vendor ID. And then we just named our subquery the latest invoice and treated it as if it was another table being joined to the vendors table. And so that's how we're able to order it by the latest invoice. And this is our result set. Now, let's say we wanted to write the same query using a join instead of a subquery, which I highly recommend in this case. Then I can select the vendor name. I can get the maximum invoice date as the latest invoice. I'll name it latest invoice, and then that's going to come from the vendors table. And then I'm going to use a left join, because we're not joining this implicitly. We're joining it in a way to where we're only joining the left columns of the left table. So I'm going to do that on invoices, and that's going to be on the vendors.vendor_id, and that's going to be equal to the invoices.vendor_id. And then I'm going to group by vendor name and order by latest invoice in the descending order. And then I'm going to run this query, and you see we get the same exact result set. Instead, in this case, instead of using a correlated query, which is a subquery in the select clause, we just simply use the left join on the vendor ID from the vendors and invoices table, and we got the same exact result set. So far, the examples you've seen of queries that use subqueries have been relatively simple. However, these type of queries can get complicated in a hurry, particularly if the subqueries are nested. And so the examples that we're showing are relatively simple, but there are going to be situations where we are going to be using nested subqueries, and I'm going to explain those in a lot more depth so that way you can better understand them. So that is all for this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about how to use a common table expression, which is usually a select statement that creates one or more temporary tables. So thank you for watching. If you're interested in the next video, head on over to database-tutorials.com. Hit the like button on this video if you enjoyed it. Hit the unlike thumbs down on this video if you did not enjoy it. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and see you next time.